Good morning and welcome to the Property Council of Australia's Federal Budget Insights event. We'll be unpacking the forecasts and all the announcements made by Josh Frydenberg at his second pandemic budget last night. I'm Ken Morrison, Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia. I'm delighted to say we've got over 200 people joining us this morning from right around the country. Also joining me are three industry experts who are going to help us understand the key forecasts and what they think the impacts on business will be. It's a great pleasure to have you all with me this morning. I'm joining you live from Canberra today, which is the home of the Ngunnawal people. On behalf of us all, wherever we might be around the country, I'd like to pay my respects for the Indigenous owners of traditional lands and their leaders, past, present and emerging. Today's live stream is brought to you by Yardi, one of the Property Council's very long-standing partners. Yardi is one of the world's largest property technology firms and provides a range of different systems solutions for their clients. We'll now cross to Singapore to hear from Bernie Devine, Regional Director, Asia Pacific at Yardi.
Hey everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Ken. I wish I could be there in person. I'm Bernie Devine. I lead Yardi's business across APAC, and I'm a CPA and economist with over 30 years experience in the real estate and technology industries. Our focus at Yardi is on providing software for the real estate industry, and in particular, investment, asset and property management. And we believe that by helping you automate business process, we help you capture the data you need to better manage your portfolios and to deliver better results in a more timely manner. Yardi and the Property Council have had a long partnership. At Yardi, we help the real estate industry associations globally, as we see this as a great way to ensure the industry is strong and growing. And in our partnership with the Property Council, we see that over recent years has grown from strength to strength as we have enhanced a number of initiatives, including gathering more information on the technology that real estate companies use. Today, we're all looking forward to understanding what we got last night. Will the budget deliver what's needed to kickstart growth and demand for the real estate industry, or do we have some challenges? Our speakers today are industry experts with a depth of understanding of economics and the real estate industry. They come to you from the heart of the action in Canberra and across New South Wales. Please enjoy, and we do hope that you'll get good value out of this event and return on investment for your time. So enjoy today. Thank you. Over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Bernie, Nina, and all the team at Yardi. It's great to have you involved. I'd also like to thank CBRE for partnering with us on this event. They're kindly hosting our panel up in Sydney. So a big thanks to CBRE for all your continued support for the Property Council. Well, last night the Property Council was part of the budget lock-up here in Canberra. The team spent the evening poring over all the numbers and the key forecasts. You would have seen the Property Council's budget brief that came out to you overnight. This is also available on our website if you missed that email. Josh Frydenberg's budget might not have delivered as many surprises last night as we normally expect, but there were some very strong economic numbers, some pretty strong spending as well, and really some uncertainty remaining around what is going to be happening with our international borders. So what does that mean for the economy and for the property industry? Well, to help us understand some of those issues and many more, I'm delighted to be joined virtually from Sydney by Felicity Emmett, the Senior Economist at ANZ, David Harrison, who's the Managing Director and Group CEO at Charter Hall, and is also a Property Council of Australia's National President, and Stuart Penklis, Head of Residential at Mirvac, who is also the Chair of our Residential Development Council. The order of events this morning will be that Felicity Emmett will provide us with an overview of some of the key measures and key economic indices from last night's budget. Then we'll be joined by the other panel members to go through what it means for this industry. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Felicity and to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And thank you to the PCA and welcome to everyone. This is a very exciting time. It's a big spending budget. You can see from my slide pack there that I've titled it Swinging for the Boundary, and that's exactly what Josh Frydenberg and the government have done here. They've really hit the ball into the park. They're really trying to drive that unemployment rate down and drive the economy harder. This is very much a Team Australia budget, working alongside the RBA to really drive better economic outcomes. There is also, I think, one eye on the election, which is scheduled to happen in the next year, and I think that's certainly part of it as well. But I'll get started now with my slides. So first up, as I say, this is a really significant big spending budget. The deficits are much larger than we and most people expected, because what the government has done is, while the economy is in better shape, they've chosen to spend most of those gains to help drive further gains in the economy over time. The economic forecasts are really actually quite conservative. They show the unemployment rate improving over time, but it's not really getting down to 4.5% until into 2024, which is really quite some time away. And that is much more conservative than the RBA's expecting. So I think that that's a good thing, and hopefully the economy ends up beating those numbers. Now, the main measures that we saw in the budget last night, the big spending measures were aged care, around $18 billion of that over 4 years, spread across home care packages and residential aged care. There was also money for mental health. There's money for tax cuts for both businesses in terms of an extension of that instant asset write-off and loss carryback, and also tax cuts for low and middle income earners in terms of an extension of the rebate for another year. As well as that, we saw quite a lot of spending on the NDIS, but rather than a new initiative, that really just represents a blowout in cost. So that's certainly something I think that deserves a little bit more scrutiny. So you can see from this chart how large the deficits are. So it is for 2020-21, the deficit is quite a bit smaller than originally anticipated, but still very large at $161 billion. For next year, 2021-22, we're looking at $107 billion. So you can see on that chart there, much bigger than the sorts of deficits we ran at the time of the global financial crisis. And also, even if we look at this as a percent of GDP, the deficit for this current financial year is nearly 8%. At the height of the GFC, the deficit was about 4%, and the same in the 1990s. So even accounting for this, this is a really big spending budget, and we've got, as you can see from the chart, a number of years of quite significant spending. Now, this chart here that I'm showing you, this is a little bit of an economist chart, but bear with me and I will make it worth your while. What the government has done here, as I mentioned previously, is that the economy is in much better shape. Now, going into this budget, we already knew that the 2020-21 budget was about $40 billion better off. So the government had that potential to spend that money, and it meant that further budgets further out were going to benefit from the better starting point of the economy. So this chart, if you look at the blue bars, they represent the positive contribution from the better starting point of the economy to the budget. So it's all positive because we're in a much better position. The yellow bars represent the extra spending decisions that the government has made in this budget to spend that money. So what we've seen is actually the government's almost fully offset that better position that they were in from the economy. So about $96 billion worth of extra spending, $104 billion we would have been better off from the economy. So this is how the government's been able to afford this, because we're in a much better position going into the budget. So it is really a little bit unusual to see this level of spending when the unemployment rate now has come down so far and the economy is already set to grow very strongly. But it is, I think, as I mentioned before, really a paradigm shift for the government, moving to really drive that unemployment rate down. Now, gross debt, net debt, both measures are going to be very, very high. So what we'll see is a peak in debt of just over 40% in 2024-25, which is really, extraordinarily high for Australia. We do have to think about it though in terms of international comparisons, and when we look across to most Western economies are running public debt well above 100% of GDP. So we are still a very low debt country by international standards. But more importantly, the cost of servicing that debt is very low. So this chart here shows how the cost of servicing that debt, even over the 4 or 5 year period of forward estimates, still remains below 1% of GDP. So that is really important when we're thinking or worrying about that debt. Servicing it is actually going to be very inexpensive compared to history or in the early or mid 1990s, as you can see, when the cost was significantly higher. Now, one of the not so good pieces of news out of the budget last night was the government's forecast for population growth. So they have revised that down again. So for the current year, they're expecting 0.1%. For next year, 21-22, 0.2%. And then even as far as 22-23, they're only expecting about 0.8%. So this is down from the 1.6% or so rate of population growth we were seeing before the pandemic, and is the lowest rates of population growth since World War I. So it's incredibly low, and Australia has really benefited from strong population growth over the past few years. It's been a big driver of GDP growth and a big driver of housing demand. So that lack of population will weigh on growth and weigh on the housing sector, or certainly provide a headwind. Now, it's really because of our closed borders. The budget's assuming that our borders don't really open up until the middle of 2022. Net overseas migration will be negative this year and next year, and it will take a while before we get those permanent migrants back in. So that is something I think that is cause for concern, and another reason why the vaccination rollout probably needs to be expedited. Now, this is my last slide. This just goes through some of the measures that the budget has announced for the property sector. Most of these measures were actually announced in the weeks leading up to the budget, so there really wasn't a lot of new news last night. So for the housing sector, we've got an extension of the new home guarantee, another 10,000 places for 21-22. We had the announcement of the family home guarantee, 10,000 places over 4 years for single parents, and they only need a deposit as much as 2%. So that is certainly helping that sector of the market, and it adds to the sort of gender lens that the government put on the budget, with a number of other measures targeted towards women. An increase from 30 to 50,000 that can be released from super under the First Home Super Saver scheme, an additional 125 million for social housing. Really, that is really nothing in comparison to some of the state spending that we've seen, and a reduction in the minimum age from 65 to 60 years to access the downsizer scheme for people to make a contribution, a one-off contribution to their super if they sell their home. And apart from that, we've had the announcement a while back about the extension of the home builder construction commencement time, and a little bit more money on infrastructure spending. The announcement was for $10 billion extra over 10 years. Some of this had already been announced, and some of this is actually cost blowout. So not a lot more on the infrastructure front from the federal government last night. But with that, I'll hand back to you, Ken. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. That's a great overview. We'll jump into many of those issues in the panel discussion. Before we do jump into that panel discussion, I'd just like to remind our viewers that you also have the opportunity to ask questions. I'd really encourage you to do so. I'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can this morning. They come up on my screen just in front of me here. It's now my great pleasure to cross live to our panel in Sydney, where David Harrison and Stuart Penklis join Felicity in the studio. Folks, thanks very much for joining me this morning. Let's start with the economy, and this is a pretty strong economy that we're seeing showcased in the budget today. So, Felicity, I'd just like to reflect on, we're going to end up with 3.75% GDP growth this calendar year, still at 3.5% next year. Does that accord with the ANZ's forecasts?
Look, if anything, Ken, the government's a little bit conservative here. I mean, when we look at what the RBA is expecting for 21-22, their recent forecast, just released last week, had 5%. We're expecting in the high fours. So I think the government has been quite conservative here. I think that's the right thing for them to do, because obviously this affects their receipts and payments. But I would be hoping that we'll actually achieve even better outcomes than what the government is forecasting. And this budget will help us to achieve that.
And David, how sustained does this economic recovery feel? Does it feel like it's going to last, or does it feel a bit flashy and recovery-led?
No, I think the government's got to be complimented on responding to the pandemic. There's no doubt the 21-22 GDP growth rate's going to be reasonably strong, and I agree with Felicity, it may be stronger than what the budget forecast suggests, because, let's face it, it's coming off a low base from the previous financial, or this current financial year. When you look at the building blocks that is driving that GDP growth, I think we've got lower unemployment than we all expected. Yes, we have got the drag of negative net migration, and we've got the drag of international borders currently closed, but will reopen as the vaccine rollout goes through the FY22 years. So I think there are some good signs. That the reality is that why the government is stimulating the economy is that the central bank's got very few bullets left at 0.1% official interest rates, and therefore that the fiscal policy has to stimulate the economy until we can start seeing those net migration numbers get our population growth back to sort of pre-COVID levels. And in that instance, we shouldn't underestimate that the escape expenditure that previously occurred with Australians travelling overseas has been predominantly spent in this country. Yes, it's led to higher savings rates, but I think we've got some interesting structural tailwinds that will help support a sustained recovery.
We'll come back and talk about international borders. There's quite a few issues there. Stuart, if I can go to you, residential has been sort of the great white charger of the economy, the economic recovery, I guess. Of course, led by home builder. How do you see the residential markets performing over the next year and beyond?
Yeah, look, I think if we go back 12 months ago and the work that we all did in working with the federal government to design that home builder stimulus, it's certainly been unbelievable in terms of its effect on the ground. 120,000 applications, I think, 20 years record in terms of new home commencements. I think 12-year record in terms of first home buyer loan application. So it's certainly hit the ground, and we're seeing the success of that. I suppose there is an element, and the Treasurer alluded to this last night, of a pull forward in demand. So we're watching that very carefully. I think it's welcomed from the industry overnight in terms of the extension to the home builder commencements and giving a bit more of a relief to builders being able to respond to the unprecedented demand. So I think the message this morning is obviously we're cautious about the pull forward and what that demand over the next 2 years looks like, particularly as there's probably a bit of a delay in terms of international immigration coming back on. But from a ground zero perspective, we're certainly still seeing very strong numbers, very strong demand, and I suppose at this point in time led by Victoria, where demand on the ground is still extremely strong.
All three of you are saying this glass is definitely well and truly more than half full. We should be very positive about where we are. Let's go through and pick a couple of the key indices out of the budget, or key economic indices, and talk about those. Let's start with employment. So, a whopping, David, you said how strong employment had been, 6.5% employment growth this year, but 1% over the next 2 years. Felicity, can I get you to comment on that? It seems, of course, we were never going to do what we're going to do this year, but 1% seems a little bit on the low side, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, it is, again, like some of their other forecasts, it is relatively conservative. And I would hope that given the stimulus, we would beat that. And certainly our forecasts and the RBA's suggest we will. We do have to keep in mind, though, that we have employment is already back to above pre-pandemic levels. And so the gains from here on are going to be much harder won than what we've had since sort of the low in June or so last year. So I think it is right in a way to be conservative, but when we look at some of the leading indicators for the labour market, things like ANZ job ads, things like hiring intentions from the business surveys, they are all going gangbusters, and they do suggest there's an enormous amount of strength in labour demand. So I would be very surprised, given the strength in a range of indicators, if we don't get something better than 1% in the coming year.
There's certainly the number that comes out of the ANZ Property Council survey as well. David, you have your Charter Hall business looks into different parts of the economy. Do you see this employment growth coming through strongly? What's your take on what might happen?
There's two key issues. If you split the business community between SMEs and large corporates, the SMEs are facing right now the drop-off of JobKeeper, and therefore none of us have really got any data to work on post 31 March. So I think they and their ability to sustain growth will drive the numbers of employment growth in the SME sector. Large corporates, in my opinion, are still pretty cautious. We're not seeing a huge amount of net investment from corporate Australia. When you think about it, with these sort of GDP growth numbers and record low interest rates, you would have thought stimulatory investment would be far greater than it has been. And I think there's a level of cautiousness that we need to see unfold and evolve into optimism before we can really call a ball on large-scale employment growth at the big end of town. At the same time, you've seen a number of large organisations announce cutbacks. All the banks have been going through this. You've got big employers in, say, the airline industry that are still struggling with the delay, if you like, in international visitation and travel, business travel. So I think there's for me, it's probably a reasonable budget in the sense that you wouldn't want to be overly bullish about employment growth in fiscal 22. 23, 24, as I said earlier, with enough gap to sort of get through the loss of JobKeeper and hopefully opening up the borders and an effective vaccine rollout, I would have expected 23 to be a much stronger employment growth number over 22, but I'm not surprised about the 22 number.
Stuart, if I could go to you, when we're talking about the residential construction chain, we're seeing actually constraints, labour constraints. If we roll that forward, Are you already seeing, wage pressures and other price pressures in the supply chain around residential construction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose again it's sort of a two-speed economy at the moment in the house and land area of our business. We're probably starting to see some cost pressure, but only minor. However, then you move into the inner rings and you start to think about built form and higher density residential construction, and we're seeing very competitive tendering at the moment. We're seeing subcontractors looking at their forward workbooks and really wanting to lock in work over the next 12 to 18 months. So some very healthy tendering in that segment of the market, and I think last night you saw Treasury call out they were quite wary of demand and supply in that built form segment of the market, and we're certainly seeing that on the ground. There's not a lot of new commencements, and I think that will continue over the next 12 to 18 months.
And in fact, just staying with dwelling construction there, so the Treasury forecasts say that next financial year will be a 0% increase, and then we'll actually see declines in dwelling construction as that population growth factor takes over. Would that accord with how you're seeing the world, Stuart?
Absolutely, and I suppose, trying to push as hard as possible is for government to encourage investment ahead of opening up the borders and really encourage countries and populations overseas to start to invest into Australia ahead of planned migration. But we're certainly seeing it on the ground at the moment, where demand for built form in the middle rings and higher densities is really driven by local owner-occupiers, upgraders, and we're starting to see some investors coming back, but largely investors at the moment really dominating the master plan communities space.
Yeah. Felicity, Stu's comments on wage pressures, which, a little bit there in residential, the residential construction processes, but the budget forecasts are pretty low in terms of wage and price pressures in the economy. If you're saying that the economy could easily outperform those employment numbers, do you think there's a risk that well, is it a risk or is it a good thing that we actually see more heat come into those inflationary pressures? What's your view of what might happen and whether that would be a good or bad thing?
Yeah, no, I would hope that by 24-25 we've got better wage growth than what the government's forecasting at 2.5%. That is, if we've got something higher than that, then the RBA's more likely to be meeting its inflation target, and also household incomes will rise, and then that flows back through into the economy. So I think these numbers are really conservative. And if we look at the wage and inflation forecast together, there is essentially no real wage growth out in those further out years. So that is not a good situation for the economy. So I think the government is being deliberately conservative here. It's much better for them to be in a position where they beat their economic forecasts, both politically and financially. And so I think it would be a good thing if we saw stronger wage pressure. I mean, clearly at the moment we're seeing some pockets of wages pressure, construction, a few other industries, some of the industries that have been hit hard by the closed borders, like hospitality, where they do a very significant share of their workforce comes from temporary visitors. So we are seeing a few wage pressures there. Most of the difficulty finding people at that wage level is not really translating at the moment to broad-based wage pressures, except in a few little pockets, and resi construction is one of them, and in some states like Western Australia it's much stronger than others. But at the moment there's no real aggregate wage pressure, but I would hope that by the end of the forecast period that we've got a lot better than 2.5% wage growth.
David, you made the comment earlier around investment confidence from the big end of town. The budget papers show that non-mining investment is going to stay low until the out year. where it'll pick up to well over 6%, which is a very big number. So you think that we are likely to be in a situation where that confidence will switch on, where the big company CEOs do say, yep, we need to get in behind growth here?
Look, it's actually linked to the last question. You know, there's a lot of debate you've said about the trajectory of inflation. You know, you've seen the bond market, you know, go from 0.8% to 1.8%, and then, you know, that fluctuates sort of almost 10% weekly. People are really struggling with trying to nail whether there is going to be, you know, inflation and real wage growth. You know, we've got 1,500 tenant customers, so we've got a pretty strong lens into the economy across a whole range of different sectors. And apart from some isolated sectors, we don't see wages growth. We don't see the pressure. There's too many parts of the economy that are still, you know, suffering. You talk about hospitality. Look at the retail sector, big employer. You know, the airline industries. You've got the banking sector where there's net, you know, job reductions. You've got big employers like Telstra that have announced. So you can't really have outsized wages growth when there is moderation in the number of jobs available. I think we're going to see also, as I said earlier, just a time for non-mining investment to actually take off. I think what the budget's saying is they think there'll be a pause, but then when the confidence ticks in, it'll be a big surge, which is why they're estimating what they're doing. But I think generally we're not seeing, and I agree with Stu, we're doing a lot of tendering on construction at the moment, and I'm not seeing price escalations. So labour and commodities are, you know, at a point where we're not seeing explosions in contract pricing. So I think that tells you that we're in a, you know, some people call it Goldilocks, but, you know, we're in this low growth environment. We're probably not going to see strong inflation other than, you know, the reality is 22 fiscal is going to be strong over 21 fiscal. It's just in almost all metrics. And the last thing I'd say is that until we see the sort of longer term optics for large non-mining investment, that is going to delay some drivers of further employment growth. So I think we are, and I think the Reserve Bank's made it pretty clear, they don't see official rates moving for a couple of years, and I think that's a function of that the inflation rate's going to be more modest than we expect. And you know, I think the budget papers are expecting maybe getting to 2.5% in fiscal 24. That put it this way, it wouldn't surprise me if we didn't get to 2.5% by 24. It might take till 25 or 26.
So what do you think the impact will be on the economic recovery in North America and Europe in particular? You know, they're well ahead in their vaccinations. You know, their economies will be starting to do that rebound thing as the virus gets under control. Do you think that will be a spur for Australian growth? David, what do you think that will do to sentiment here?
Oh, look, there's so many parts of the Australian economy, other than the stock market, that's linked to the US. The question is how much of that rebound in the US is going to lead to further investment in Australia and more importantly, consumption of what we export. You know, my view is we're in many ways more disconnected from the economic cycles in the US than we have in many decades. So I think where the fortune of the Australian economy is much more tied to what we export, and therefore I think the US, Europe, UK, that rebound has much less impact. I think we're much more reliant on, you know, what we sell to China and Japan and other parts of Asia, and those economies are also going through an infrastructure-led, you know, rebuilding phase, particularly China. So despite the geopolitical environment, We still have the best quality iron ore in the world for them to buy. You've seen where spot prices have got to. I think that's probably going to continue to be a driver rather than a rebound in the US, which let's not lose or not lose sight of the fact that the US is a very insular consumption economy. So it'll drive the benefits within the US rather than from people who sell goods to them.
Great. I've just been told we actually got nearly 400 viewers. We've got questions running through as well, so that's fantastic. I'll come to some of those in a minute. Let's go to international borders, which we've danced around a little bit. So the numbers are not great, as Felicity said. Really, we're not getting started on borders until sometime next year, and the budget papers are really very non-committal about what might happen. And I think Greg Hunt's been out this morning to say, well, this is a forecast, not a decision of government. So we really don't know what's going to happen here with borders, but the impacts are significant here. Stu, in residential land, we're sort of defying gravity at the moment, aren't we? How long do you think that can go on for before that gravitational pull of very low population growth starts taking over?
Yeah, look, I think it's really interesting, and it varies from state to state at the moment. But what we're seeing at the moment on the ground, like obviously home build has been fabulous on the urban edge, but where the challenge really is commencements in the inner rings, and we're obviously seeing a bit of a legacy of supply still coming through from the last few years of very heightened levels of activity in the multi-res sector. With a number of, my experience on the ground at the moment, we've obviously launched and commenced a number of apartment projects into markets where there actually isn't a lot of supply, and we're really soaking up demand from, as I said previously, upgraders and downsizers and people, selling their family home and downsizing into an apartment. That demand is healthy, but it's to a certain degree in balance at the moment because there isn't a lot of supply coming through. So the next few years will be subdued. I think the important thing is, particularly here in New South Wales, we need to plan for the next few years. We need to be ready for immigration to turn back on and plan for that growth and plan for that activity. So from a federal government perspective, I suppose there wasn't a whole lot of talk around how we're going to deal with the supply issue and how we're going to respond to the supply issue in the coming years. But hopefully we start to see some focus in the state budgets as they come down. But the next 2 years will be subdued in terms of apartment commencements. We just need to look ahead and plan for that next wave of immigration and make sure that what we're delivering and the planning is aligned to be able to respond to that demand when it comes back on.
So one of our questions is actually on state budgets, and Stu, I'll stay with you. Is there a role for state budgets to put some stimulus in to deal with some of that apartment overhang that we're seeing in a number of markets?
Absolutely, and I think some of the stamp duty discussions that are happening at the moment in terms of being able to deal with some of that hangover of apartment stock, but also to help hopefully some of the key workers into the market, first home buyers into the market, and obviously starting to look at how do we attract some of that foreign investment into Australia ahead of immigration. And we know the UK's done a great job in terms of attracting immigration from Hong Kong, and I think that we need to be on the front foot to really be attracting that investment into Australia, even though borders may not open for a year and a half.
Felicity, staying with borders, obviously if you're in residential construction, that's a huge deal, but this is really important for a number of other areas, isn't it? That's the skill gaps which we are experiencing in a number of sectors of the economy, the income earning areas of education and tourism. Property councils put forward the idea of upgrading our investment in quarantine capacity, so we're able to bring more people over the border even as we're still in a sort of a locked situation as a country. You know, do you think Treasury, in your reading of the budget papers, does Treasury and the government understand the multidimensional impacts of having extraordinarily low population growth will have right through the economy?
Look, I think they probably understand, but I think they have obviously been slow to appreciate what they need to do, perhaps to help improve the situation. I mean, even in the budget last night, you know, the vaccination rollout, all there is a comment that we will have a nationwide vaccination rollout plan by the end of this year. Now, that is pretty slow, really, compared to what we've seen, especially in countries like the US and the UK, and even in Europe. Now, obviously, they had a lot more sense of urgency given the level of cases. So it has been, I think, they have been very slow to organise alternative quarantine arrangements so we can get more people back. And I think they really can't start to bring people back in volumes until we have herd immunity here, and that, you know, means sort of around 70% of the population vaccinated. We're a long way from that, and hence their assumption and as they say, this is not really a promise, this is just a forecast, that borders will largely open by mid-2022. But there's no real sense of whether still people may have to quarantine. So I think this is problematic. As you say, as we've all said, this is really going to be a headwind for growth and for the housing sector in particular. So I think that doesn't seem to be a lot there that they are doing to address this, to maybe expedite that opening of the borders.
David, you talk to a lot of political leaders. Do you think they get this? Do you think there's solutions coming, or do you think they're still trying to come up with what the answers are here?
Oh, look, Ken, I think they get it. The politics of this are pretty stark. You've had 2 state elections where the incumbent leaders have been re-elected with resounding majorities based on lockdown safety measures, that they are protecting their people in each state. And the reality is, I think the federal government is taking a view that the economic cost of not opening up the borders needs to be balanced with the great work Australia has done. Thankfully, we're an island, to isolate ourselves and have probably one of the best responses to the pandemic globally, which is why we're all talking about, you know, the economy being in a better position than we expected. So I think they get it. I think the stark reality is that we have emerging economies with the pandemic out of control. We've had major economies like the US and the UK and parts of Europe with terrible and tragic loss of life from not controlling the virus. So, I think all levels of government are going to be very focused on health and safety first, and dealing with the economic consequences of not opening up the borders second. And I think, if you think Australians, taxpayers are shareholders of the Australian government, I think they're getting plenty of messages from their shareholders that the Australian people want health and safety first, and we'll deal with the economic consequences second. As a business leader, you'd like to try to get a little more balance, but I think we are where we are, and I think the situation globally will be watched very carefully, because if we open up too quickly and essentially import a bigger problem than we've got at the moment, well, the economic consequences may well be a lot worse than the delayed opening up of international borders.
Yeah, big dilemma. Let's go to some of the specific announcements in the budget, or many of which were foreshadowed in advance of the budget. Stu, if I could start with you, some of the housing initiatives we've seen, the first home guarantee extended, which is good. What's your take on the family home guarantee and some of the other measures announced preceding the budget?
Ken, obviously all positive. They all, obviously not as meaningful as what home builders contributed to the market, but I think interestingly it all goes to sentiment and it all goes to activity. And even in New South Wales, where we didn't see as much of an effect from home builder just in terms of the supply constraints and price points, it certainly, all these measures go to positive sentiment. So, from a residential perspective, those announcements overnight welcomed. I think the incentives or the changes around encouraging people to downsize out of their family homes, again, another initiative which is a positive and hopefully will go towards stimulating activity in that built form, middle ring, inner ring apartment market.
David, the infrastructure spend, a very big infrastructure program. In your look at the projects that's going to, you think they're worthy projects? Is one of the questions that's come from the viewers.
There's good infrastructure and not so good infrastructure. I think most of this infrastructure is positive. It's going to create jobs and create and improve transport amenity and productivity. If you think about this financial year 21 and even 20, the government had to stimulate the economy through a lot of subsidies like JobKeeper, etc. If you think about it, I think they're now moving into a longer term, more sustainable fiscal stimulus that we all know infrastructure investment is positive for the economy. It will not just be stimulated by government sector expenditure. There will be private sector participation in a lot of infrastructure programs. So I do think it is positive. There's only so many bullets they've got. So I think there's a reasonable balance between the wealth redistribution and their focus on social welfare and aged care, but also not losing sight of the fact that we need to, if you think about that, 161 billion, a lot of that is being spent on infrastructure, which will drive employment growth. So, we'd all like to see, particularly in the property industry, greater infrastructure investment to stimulate the property sector. But I think, at the end of the day, it's generally positive, and I noticed that it was pretty well distributed geographically. If you look at the per capita spend in each state, there certainly doesn't appear to be much bias there. So I think you'd be a pretty hard commentator to say that it hasn't been pretty balanced geographically around Australia.
Yeah, almost all of it off the Infrastructure Australia's priority list, which is good to see. We also saw in the budget last night, announced in advance, and also a few extras last night, some work that Peter Verwer, my predecessor, has been doing for the government as part of the Prime Minister's Special Envoy in this. David, again, I'll stay with you. This is all about attracting global talent to Australia. What's your take on those initiatives?
Look, if you look at the let's just talk about foreign investment. For the last 18 months, the investment in Australia has been propped up by foreign investment. So despite lots of talk around FIRB, etc., I think the Foreign Investment Review Board has processed a lot of foreign investment capital. Stu can talk about it, but the emergence of build to rent is really being backed by foreign investment. Yes, they'd like to get some, improved withholding tax rates, but that's where I think a lot of the foreign capital is important in what I call developing sectors. If I think about agriculture, foreign pension funds have driven the investment in agriculture in this country. We've seen it with student housing. We're seeing it with build to rent. We're seeing it with aged care. So I think that balancing the need to attract foreign capital with domestic capital is important. I think it's also fantastic that the superannuation industry has got through its sort of mini liquidity crisis last year, and the government is continuing with the growth in the surcharge. So I think that investment bucket is really important to have a balance between domestic source capital and foreign capital to help drive the overall economy. And as I said earlier, there is no doubt infrastructure generally, when the public sector looks for private sector participation, there's a big component of that coming from foreign capital. So, I think that's all positive.
I'm going to ask each of you a final question now. We're running towards time. Felicity, let's look at the debt issue. You said 40% of GDP, a lot lower than many other comparable countries, but it's still nearly $1 trillion is where we peak at. Is that too high? Are you worried about our residual net debt levels?
No, I'm not, Ken, because when we look back in history, the way that governments normally recover from large deficits is that they grow their way out of it. You don't grow your way out of a large deficit with austerity measures. So I think that what the government's doing alongside the RBA is really trying to kickstart the economy here. They are spending so that they will get more back and will have stronger growth and hopefully beat lots of the government's expectations laid out in the budget last night, so that actually the deficit profile will look, and debt will look, a lot better. So I think that they're actually, really, this is not really a typical coalition type budget. This is more a Labor budget, a big spending budget, but I think they are definitely trying to spend their way out to grow the economy, and that those debt numbers will then come down more quickly over time.
And David, is the government missing an economic reform agenda here? Are they playing it a bit too safe? Should we be setting up more for the longer term at this time?
Look, I think those of us in the business community would always like to see all governments doing more in terms of tax reform. We still have pretty unproductive taxes. Unfortunately, that's a state level based tax with stamp duty. But there are a number of different reforms we'd prefer to see. As I said earlier, I think there's going to be a time for that. I'm not sure they can do tax reform at a time when they're trying to, if you like, help do the heavy lifting, given that the central bank's done as much as it can. So I think we're going to have to expect next year and the year after budget to see any effective reform. Yes, we'd like to see some more tax reform that may create more efficient tax systems, but like right at the moment, I'm not sure it's as big a priority as some of the other things they've announced. So I guess we'll wait for next year to see if we can get some more genuine reform, not just in tax, in a whole range of different areas.
And Stu, we mentioned earlier that we have the states and territories all doing their budgets over coming months. What would you like to see from some of those state and territory budgets?
Look, I think that particularly here in New South Wales, I think the budget ideally would be focused around how do we set the New South Wales economy up for dealing with, hopefully, borders opening, attracting immigration into New South Wales, and really focusing on how do we generate the supply needed, the affordable supply needed to support jobs in New South Wales. I think from a Victorian government perspective, probably supply is not such an issue, and just making sure the settings are right to attract that international investment and immigration into Victoria. I think that importantly the states need to recognise that they're part of a global economy, and attracting population, attracting immigration is people make decisions on a global basis. So making sure we've got the settings right to really set the states up for future growth and prosperity.
Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for this morning. A big thank you to Felicity, David and Stuart for giving us the benefit of their time and their fantastic insights. I'd also like to thank Yardie once again for their generous support of this event and many of our other national events and programs. Before I sign off, I've got a few things I wanted to mention. If you register before 30 June, you'll receive 20% off all Property Council Academy courses, e-learning and in-house training. Already more than 400 people have registered for our Property Congress in Hobart in October, which is fantastic news, but places are limited, so I'd really encourage you to register to secure your spot. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, including former Prime Minister John Howard. And finally, our Innovation and Excellence Awards program is in judging phase right now. To make sure you book your table for the gala dinner, go to our website and you can book for that dinner, which is on the 13th of August, and that will be in Sydney. So thank you all for tuning in this morning and for your ongoing commitment to the Property Council. Have a great day, and I will look forward to seeing you soon.